The US media has played a key role in whitewashing the horrifying crimes committed by Israel against the Palestinian people in Gaza with the full support of the US government under both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Yet those crimes have become so blatant and so impossible to deny that slowly the US media is having to admit what is actually happening. The leading US newspaper, the New York Times, has been one of the leading media outlets spreading nonstop propaganda in support of Israel, denying and whitewashing the crimes it committed against the Palestinian people. And yet, this July, after nearly 2 years of Israel's US-sponsored genocide in Gaza, the New York Times finally published an article admitting that what Israel is doing is indeed a genocide sponsored by the US government. And this was an article published by an Israeli scholar who served in the Israeli military, the IDF, and he's a world-renowned expert on genocide. He wrote, quote, "My inescapable conclusion has become that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. Having grown up in a Zionist home, lived the first half of my life in Israel, served in the IDF as a soldier and officer, and spent most of my career researching and writing on war crimes and the Holocaust. This was a painful conclusion to reach, and one that I resisted as long as I could. But I have been teaching classes on genocide for a quarter of a century. I can recognize one when I see one," end quote. Those were the words of Omer Bartov, who is an Israeli scholar born and educated in Israel. And today he is a professor of Holocaust and genocide studies at Brown University, an elite Ivy League school in the US. And in this article that he wrote in the New York Times, he explained how he came to this inescapable conclusion that Israel is carrying out a US-sponsored genocide against the Palestinian people. He noted that when Palestinians attacked the Israeli colonial regime in October of 2023, after Israel had carried out an illegal criminal blockade of Gaza for more than a decade, and of course all of that context has been erased, but when Palestinians attacked the Israeli occupiers in October 2023, this scholar, Omer Bartov, initially said that it was not a genocide, although he acknowledged that Israel carried out war crimes and potentially crimes against humanity. However, he acknowledged that as Israel continued to carry out this genocide after October 2023, he noted that in May 2024, the IDF ethnically cleansed 1 million Palestinians who were sheltered in Rafah in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And then the Israeli regime completely destroyed Rafah. And he wrote, quote, "At that point, it appeared no longer possible to deny that the pattern of IDF operations was consistent with the statements denoting genocidal intent made by Israeli leaders in the days after the Palestinian attack in October of 2023. Going on in this article, this Israeli scholar noted that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu urged Israelis to remember Amalek, which is a reference to a biblical passage in which God tells the Israelites to, quote, "kill alike men and women, infants and sucklings," end quote, which again is genocide, complete annihilation. Then Israeli regime officials said they were fighting, quote, "human animals," end quote, so demonizing Palestinians as animals. And then Israeli officials called for, quote, "total annihilation," end quote. And the deputy speaker of Israel's parliament, Nissim Vatori, said that Israel's task must be, quote, "erasing the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth," end quote. This Israeli scholar then went on and he said, quote, "Those engaged in the worldwide culture of commemoration and remembrance built around the Holocaust will have to confront a moral reckoning. The wider community of genocide scholars is now edging ever closer toward a consensus over describing events in Gaza as a genocide. In November, a little more than a year into the war, the Israeli genocide scholar Shmuel Lederman joined in the growing chorus of opinion that Israel was engaged in genocidal actions. The Canadian international lawyer William Shabas came to the same conclusion last year and has recently described Israel's military campaign in Gaza as absolutely a genocide, end quote. Now, I have to say it is incredible seeing this in the New York Times, considering that the Times has been one of the leading propagandists in support of the genocidal Israeli regime, and the New York Times itself is directly complicit in these US-sponsored crimes committed against the Palestinian people for years. This did not start in October 2023. And as recently as a few weeks ago, in June, the New York Times was still publishing articles praising Israel as a hero. The New York Times employs the extreme pro-war neoconservative columnist Bret Stephens, who's paid a very fat salary and has become very rich, vomiting out propaganda in support of the US empire and the Israeli colonial regime. In June, when the US and Israel were waging war on Iran, he published an article titled, "Israel had the courage to do what needed to be done," end quote. So this is the kind of nonsensical propaganda that the New York Times just churns out on a daily basis. And never forget how the New York Times has played a key role in printing US government lies to justify illegal US wars of aggression. Like, for instance, in the lead up to the criminal US invasion of Iraq in 2003, the New York Times published many stories falsely claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, based on lies fabricated by the CIA and other US government agencies that were obediently reprinted by the New York Times. And yet this leading US newspaper never faced any consequences over its role in justifying and being a party to these illegal US wars of aggression that blatantly violated international law. More than 1 million Iraqis died in this criminal US war. The New York Times was a party to that war, just like how the New York Times is complicit and is a party to the US-Israeli genocide in Gaza. It has printed so much propaganda. For instance, in October 2024, it printed another propaganda column by the pro-war extremist Bret Stephens titled, "We Should Want Israel to Win," in which he cheered on Israel's genocide in Gaza. And yet here we are now in July of 2025, and the New York Times can no longer deny that the US and Israel have been carrying out a genocide against the Palestinian people. And now the newspaper wants to act as though it's been on the side of justice the entire time, when in fact, the US media has been directly complicit in these crimes against humanity. And the same cynical thing is happening now in Europe, because European countries have played a key role in sponsoring Israel's genocide as well, especially Germany, which carried out one of the worst genocides in human history and is basically always on the wrong side of history and continues to support another genocide today, and also the UK and France and many other European countries. And yet now, the former top EU diplomat, Josep Borrell, who until just a few months ago was the de facto foreign minister of the European Union, now after leaving his position as the most powerful EU diplomat, where he could have actually done something, now he admits that Israel is carrying out genocide in Gaza. These were the comments made by Josep Borrell, the former European Union foreign policy chief. Quote, "We're facing the largest ethnic cleansing operation since the end of the Second World War," that is the Nazi Holocaust, "in order to create a splendid holiday destination in Gaza. Once the millions of tons of rubble have been cleared from Gaza and the Palestinians have died or gone away," end quote. He also noted that the Israeli colonial regime is starving millions of Palestinians in Gaza, civilians, as a weapon of war, which is another genocidal crime against humanity. However, again, let's not forget that when Borrell actually had power, when he was the top EU diplomat, he facilitated Israel's genocide. He was complicit in these crimes, like the New York Times.
Yes, Europe is a garden. We have built a garden. The rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, is a jungle. And the jungle could invade the garden.
But what's clearly happening is that these US-sponsored Israeli crimes have become so blatant and so undeniable that many public officials are recognizing, wow, we need to call this out. So in a few years, if there ever is justice, like there were the Nuremberg trials against the Nazis, if there is justice, these figures are saying we need to make sure that we're on record speaking out against this genocide after for nearly 2 years we helped to facilitate it. This is even happening inside the Israeli regime itself. A former Israeli prime minister, Ehud Olmert, who is himself a war criminal, who carried out horrific crimes against the Palestinian people. This did not start in 2023. This goes back to the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing, the original genocide against the Palestinian people upon which Israel was founded in 1948. And it goes back to 1967, when Israel illegally occupied the territory of multiple Arab countries, including Syria, the Golan Heights, which is still occupied by Israel to this day, and including the Sinai Peninsula, which is part of Egypt. And ever since then, for nearly 60 years, Israel has maintained its illegal occupation of Palestinian territory and Syrian territory in violation of international law, and the US government has strongly supported it as an outpost of the US empire, as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the US empire in this very strategic region. But today, as Israel is just carrying out a blatant genocide, it's being live streamed in broad daylight, it's become impossible to deny. So now some top Western officials, including Israeli regime officials, are saying, okay, this is a genocide, we need to speak out. This former Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, admitted that Israel, with US support, is building a, quote, concentration camp, end quote. This is the so-called humanitarian city, which is just so diabolically cynical. The US and Israel have created this scheme involving the Boston Consulting Group. You know, these millionaires in fancy suits sitting in air-conditioned offices in the United States. They're making these plans to carry out genocide and ethnic cleansing and build concentration camps, and yet they call it a humanitarian city. And this former Israeli prime minister admitted that it's a concentration camp and it's, quote, part of an ethnic cleansing, end quote. And I have to stress, it is so important to understand that none of this would be possible without the unflinching support of the US government. Israeli media outlets like the top Israeli newspaper Haaretz have published reports admitting, citing top Israeli military officials, that Israel could not carry out this genocide without the political and diplomatic support of the US government, and most importantly, without the weapons and ammunition provided by the US government. It would be impossible. And yet the US government continues to flood Israel with billions of dollars of weapons and ammunition, including Trump himself. Soon after returning to the White House for his second term as president, he claimed he would be a peace president, but he bypassed the Congress in order to send $8 billion more worth of weapons to Israel to help it carry out this genocide. And of course, let's be very clear here. This is not just Trump and the Republicans. It's also Joe Biden and the Democrats, because this genocide started under Biden, and Biden gave Israel nearly $20 billion worth of so-called military aid. And even that term is very misleading because it's not actually aid. This is money that goes to US private corporations, military contractors as part of the military-industrial complex, like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Boeing. These huge corporations, they get the contracts from the US government, these tens of billions of dollars. They create the weapons. It is private US corporations that profit from this. It is investors in these US corporations, many of which are listed in the S&P 500 and other major stock market indices on Wall Street. So they're all profiting from this genocide. And this is all extremely well documented. No one can say they didn't know. In fact, the United Nations published a very detailed report showing how US corporations have been directly complicit in and profiting from Israel's genocide in Gaza. This United Nations report was published in July. It is titled, From Economy of Occupation to Economy of Genocide. And it named some of the US corporations that are complicit in this genocide and how they've profited. And these include the biggest big tech corporations in Silicon Valley, including Google, whose parent company is Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft. By the way, these are the corporations that have been driving investor returns in the S&P 500. They're part of the so-called Magnificent Seven, the Mag 7, these big tech corporations that have been responsible for a huge part of the gains in the S&P 500 and in the NASDAQ stock market indices in recent years. And Wall Street investors have become extremely rich profiting off of all of this. But it's not just them. Another major US corporation that has been complicit in Israel's genocide in Gaza is Palantir. Palantir was founded by the far-right Silicon Valley billionaire oligarch Peter Thiel, who is a major supporter of Donald Trump, and he previously employed the US Vice President, J.D. Vance. And the Trump administration has contracted Palantir to spy on Americans, to compile a massive Big Brother-style database based on mass surveillance of US citizens. And by the way, the billionaire CEO of Palantir, Alex Karp, who's a right-wing Trump supporter, he boasted that the US empire is preparing for a three-front war against China, Russia, and Iran. So that's just one of these Silicon Valley corporations that is profiting from Israel's genocide in Gaza. Another US corporation named in this UN report is HP, Hewlett-Packard, and IBM. And there are deep historical echoes for this because IBM was also profiting from the Nazi Holocaust. This has been very well documented. I'm reading here from The Guardian, the major British newspaper. Quote, IBM directly supplied the Nazis with technology which was used to help transport millions of people to their deaths in the concentration camps at Auschwitz and Treblinka, end quote. And here we are today, 80 years later, and the United Nations is detailing how IBM is helping Israel carry out a Holocaust against the Palestinians with the full support of the US empire. And by the way, can you guess what was the response of the Trump administration to this report published by the UN, detailing the complicity of US corporations in the genocide in Gaza? Drum roll, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a war criminal who has supported every single US war of aggression, announced that the US government is imposing sanctions on the United Nations human rights expert who did this investigation and published this report. This is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Palestinians, Francesca Albanese, who is an Italian expert in international human rights law. And she's now under sanctions by the US regime for the supposed crime of detailing how US corporations are profiting from a genocide.
It's obscene, frankly. But right now, I want to remind everyone that the reason why these sanctions have been imposed is the pursuit of justice. Of course, I've been critical of Israel. It has been committing genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes. And not because I say that. There are criminal proceedings and international Court of Justice proceedings against Israel for these crimes, but also because there are companies who are profiting from it. And excuse me, I record the offensive and rude posture that has come from some of these companies in reaction to my report.
This is the level of criminality of the US regime. It's not a normal government. It is a genocidal regime that is sponsoring a genocide in broad daylight. Everyone in the world can see it. It's openly admitted in the New York Times. United Nations experts are publishing reports detailing that this is a genocide. And the response of the US government is to send more weapons to speed up the genocide and to impose sanctions on the UN experts who are exposing the genocide. And you really have to admire the bravery of these UN experts like Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, because she's being threatened directly by the US empire, by the most powerful regime on earth that has a long history of carrying out crimes against humanity and sponsoring genocide. And yet when she heard the news that the US regime had imposed sanctions on her, she lifted her fist in defiance and she said, quote, "The powerful punishing those who speak for the powerless. It is not a sign of strength, but of guilt," end quote. And I think Albanese will go down in history remembered as a hero, as someone who spoke out against this genocide and tried to do everything she could to stop this genocide, while the US regime and Wall Street and Silicon Valley and US capitalists and big corporations profited from this Holocaust. And I really need to emphasize that this is not new in history. US corporations also profited from the original Holocaust. US capitalists and US politicians like the Bush family. There are two different US presidents from the Bush dynasty, George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush Sr., and George W. Bush, his son, both war criminals who both waged war on Iraq and carried out horrific crimes. And the father of George Bush Sr., the grandfather of George W. Bush, Prescott Bush, was himself a wealthy capitalist who also profited from doing business with Hitler, with Nazi Germany, and profited from the original Nazi Holocaust. And I want to read some comments here that were written by Andrew Feinstein, who is a left-wing South African politician who opposed the apartheid regime. And then when apartheid was finally ended in South Africa, he was a member of parliament from the ANC, the African National Congress, which was the anti-apartheid party. And he has been a very outspoken advocate for Palestinian human rights. And he wrote, quote, "It pains me to say this, and I don't do so lightly, as the son of a Holocaust survivor, as someone who has lectured on genocide prevention at Auschwitz, where my mom lost dozens of her family. But Israel is behaving like Nazis. This is not self-defense. This is not to protect Jews. This is Nazism. This is a Holocaust driven by racist white supremacy." And I think it's very accurate to compare Israeli colonialism to fascism, because fascism and colonialism are two sides of the same coin. This was famously articulated by the anti-colonial intellectual Aimé Césaire in his very important book, Discourse on Colonialism. He explained how fascism was colonialism turned inward, that the crimes carried out by the Italian fascist regime under Mussolini and the German Nazi regime under Hitler and the Japanese fascist empire, these were all the crimes committed by the European colonial empires against colonial subjects in Latin America and Africa and Asia. But those crimes were ignored because it was not people in the West, in Europe, who were the actual direct victims of those crimes. But then the fascist regimes turned those crimes inward, those same colonial policies of extermination and genocide. In fact, the Nazis got the idea of the concentration camps from the US colonialists who created concentration camps for Native Americans as they carried out genocide against the indigenous peoples of North America. And the Nazis were also inspired by the racist apartheid system of Jim Crow in the US. They borrowed those ideas and applied them to racial and ethnic minorities inside Germany and other parts of Europe. And the crimes that the Israeli regime is carrying out today, as it's run by an American, Netanyahu, who had US citizenship twice. He was raised and educated in the US. Netanyahu is an American. He's a longtime friend of Trump. These crimes that the Israeli regime is carrying out now, this genocide, these crimes are not new. It's very similar to what the British Empire did, the genocide it carried out in India, in its colonies, to what the French Empire did, its genocidal crimes in Algeria, which was a French colony, or the genocidal crimes of the Belgian Empire in Congo, or getting back to Germany, before the Nazi Holocaust, the German Empire carried out genocide in southern Africa, in modern-day Namibia. But almost no one in the West knows about those colonial crimes carried out by the European empires. They only know about the horrific crimes carried out by the fascist regimes, because those fascist regimes used the same colonial practices inside Europe. So this is the true face of the so-called democratic West. When Western imperialist countries bloviate about democracy and human rights and why they have to interfere in the internal sovereign affairs of countries all across the global south and carry out coups and regime change operations and wars and humanitarian interventions. Never forget that these Western empires have carried out the worst crimes against humanity and genocide, and all of this rhetoric about democracy and human rights is completely cynical, it's completely hypocritical. These Western regimes have never actually been democratic. They've been the worst violators of democracy, and the fact that they've been supporting Israel's genocide for nearly 2 years in broad daylight, it's not a deviation from the great Western democracies of the past. It's not a perversion. It is exactly what they've been doing for centuries. This is the true face of Western imperialism. And as I conclude here, I must emphasize that it has been completely obvious from the very beginning that Israel has been carrying out genocide. The United Nations created a special committee that said as explicitly as possible that Israel is carrying out genocide with the full support of the US government. And these Western so-called human rights organizations that have often been complicit in US imperialist wars, justifying the US imperialist war on Libya and Syria, justifying imperialist US so-called humanitarian intervention, they're now trying to wash their hands of complicity in these crimes against humanity. And that's why Amnesty International also in 2024 admitted that Israel is carrying out genocide in Gaza. And that's why now even mainstream US media outlets like the New York Times are finally admitting the truth after nearly 2 years, after 21 months of a live stream genocide we've all seen on social media every single day. Because they can clearly see that in history, students will learn about the US-sponsored, Western-sponsored Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people carried out in 2023, 2024, and 2025 in broad daylight. They will know it will not be controversial that it was genocide. So now these Western institutions are trying to save face desperately, and they're acting as though they were always on the right side of history, but don't let them erase their complicity in these horrific crimes. And never forget how they spent 2 years smearing independent journalists and activists and scholars and advocates like us here and millions of other people around the world who from the very beginning were saying that this is a genocide and that the Palestinian people need to be supported. Supporters of Palestinian human rights were viciously attacked and smeared with nonsensical claims. And now it's clear that advocates for Palestinian human rights were always on the right side of history. And don't let the people who were complicit try to whitewash all of that and erase it. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.